Hello, Davey here, and welcome to my review of the SilverStone Tundra Series TD02-RGB all-in-one liquid CPU cooler. Okay, so first things first, first things always first, this is a review sample. I've been sent this by SilverStone, and I didn't pay a penny for it. That is my disclaimer here. So yeah, this was for free, and I don't have to send it back, so I get to keep it. So whether that affects your judgment of what this review will be like, then feel free to skip out now. Speaking of skip, you can skip to any particular part of the video if you want to by going down to the video description or the first pinned comment where there are a pile of timestamps, so you can go to the bits of the video you want to see and maybe bits like this that you don't. Coming up in this review is, well, first the unboxing and the sort of check out or look at all of the stuff that this comes with and it itself, looking at all the different parts and seeing what's what, and then obviously the build and the testing of that. But alongside those, I am testing all of these. So we've got a few radiators to go over as well to compare the all-in-one liquid cooler to a radiator. So just to give you some ideas of the performance. Obviously price is way out of whack. We'll discuss that a little later in the video and at the conclusion as well. But all in all, we've got a 280, a rather thick 280, I think it's 45mm thick, a 37mm thick 240, I think it's a 27mm thick 240, and a 120mm thin radiator. So I think again that's 37mm. Or 27mm, one or the other. Anyway, so that's pretty much that. If you want to pick this up from Amazon, then you can go to the Amazon affiliate links in the video description, but I haven't seen any good prices there, so it's probably not worth it this time around. But if you're checking this in about, I don't know, a month after I upload it, it might be better, so if you wanted to check them out, you can head to the video description. If you buy anything through those links, even toilet paper, it will give a small kickback to the channel. So I think that's pretty much it. Let's start with the unboxing. Starting with the unboxing, the first thing that struck me was the download manual prompt. So it looks like SilverStone is trying to get away from using unnecessary paper, which is something I can get behind. But we're going to have to see about the excellent price to performance claim in the testing later. Right, onto the unboxing. The recycled pulp molded tray shows more signs of environmentally friendly goodness, but what's inside the tray is what we want. In their own compartments were the fans, accessories, and AIO, but we'll get the boring stuff out of the way first. Accessories-wise, we have a whole host of hardware to suit the sockets on the screen now, but the highlights are these half-head screws, which seem to be an improvement on what the Hyper 212 Evo did, and you'll see what I mean by that later. There's also this AMD and Intel backplate, which is interesting for an odd reason, and the fan screws are nicely finished in dark grey, and the CPU and pump block screws have a satin silver finish. There's also an insulation pad for AMD sockets, which is a bit strange, as well as a few cables for the fans. And laid out right in the middle of the AMD hold-down plate is the thermal paste, which is enough for a few applications, and at least it's in a small applicator and has a window to see how much there is inside. Now, let's move on to some more entertaining stuff, the fans. Obviously, with the name, these are RGB fans, or 120mm RGB fans to be more precise. They have some nicely placed anti-vibration rubber pads to each corner, which is always nice to have, and the central logo is molded into the fan blade's hub, instead of being a sticker which never gets perfectly aligned and generally looks awful when they're just off-center, wobbling around at a lower speed. They're also pretty highly rated in terms of amperage, 0.38 amps, so you can only realistically chain two of these fans together before you overload a fan header. Now, I'm not sure if the LEDs are taking up any of that amperage, and I don't think they are, but it's also a good idea that you don't add extra fans on a larger fan splitter. If you need more fans, use other headers or just get yourself a fan hub. In terms of connectors, we have a 4-pin for PWM fan control or a universal RGB connector with a pass-through to a second RGB connector just to the left in the background. You can daisy chain these connectors to other fans or the pump and connect them to an RGB header on your motherboard if you have one, or a universal RGB controller if you don't. Or you can use the 4-pin Molex to a 4-pin connector for static blue, and even potentially rewire it to static red or green, or maybe go mental and mix it up. More on that a little later. Next up, the radiator. Now, there's plenty to talk about here. If you hadn't guessed by now, it's a 240mm radiator to suit the two 120mm fans. The first thing I noticed when looking at this was, damn, those are some thick fins. Now, this might be down to me being too used to other radiators I've used with custom water cooling loops, but we can measure this to get some objective facts over my opinion. So the TD02-RGB aluminium radiator fins are roughly 0.24mm thick. Comparing this to one of the radiators we'll be testing later, the EK Coolstream SE's copper fins clock in at 0.05mm thick. Now, it's pretty common knowledge that when it comes to cooling, surface area is king, so many thinner fins will have more surface area than less thicker fins. A thinner fin, especially one made of a more conductive material such as copper over aluminium, will also increase the thermal transfer rate, but not all that glitters is gold. Thinner fins are also way more likely to get bent out of shape, but they're also pretty easy to bend back into shape most of the time. But we'll have to see how all of this plays out later in the testing results. Moving on, the sides of the TD02 are clad in a clear plastic cover which protects the sides from getting scuffed, and the carbon fiber effect vinyl breaks up the length of the radiator with a little texture, and it's up to you if you're into that or not. Now, it has to be stressed that this is a plastic cover and does not form any part of the mechanical connection to the fans or your case. If you take a close look between the rubber pads, you can see the plastic panels wrap over the aluminium casing, and it's the aluminium casing that houses the threads for the screws. I thought it would be useful to get a second angle, but you probably got the picture before. Tubing wise, these are some pretty strong and sturdy cables. Now, I'm not going to cut these things open, but apparently they're braided with what I can imagine is some sort of steel, maybe similar to a car tyre but to a lesser extent. Either way, they're really solid and as good as I could expect them to be. As for the connection to the radiator, the collars are also surprisingly rubber, but there's a touch of adhesive seeping out of the connection. Now, this doesn't bother me, at least it proves there's something in there to keep it in place, but it's what I've noticed and I can only review what's in front of me. The other end, of course, leads to the pump and water block. The tubing connects to the block through an angled rotary connection, which is pretty standard feature for an AIO, but the top of the CPU block is where the RGB lighting continues. You can just make out the SilverStone logo through the dark plastic top, which of course looks far better once the film has been removed. The pump has a 3-pin connector, so it's DC control only, but that's not a bad thing. Link this to a chassis or system fan header on your motherboard and you can use a DC fan curve to control it. There's also a universal RGB connector with a pass-through to another to be able to daisy chain it together with the fans for the LED lighting. The base of the CPU block is copper, which is great for thermal transfer between the IHS and the liquid inside, but I can only imagine there's some sort of corrosion inhibitor to prevent corrosion between the aluminium and the copper, restricting the channels in the radiator for the life of the AIO. And because I'm kind of sad, I cleaned up the plate and went all reverse macro on the thing to check out the severity of the grooves during the machining process. It has to be said that these are some pretty noticeable grooves, which could in theory reduce the plate's effectiveness compared to a very smooth and flat surface from other premium air coolers we reviewed previously. But the counter argument is that the thermal paste will account for this, but I haven't got test data to prove either way, so all I can do is test this and compare it to the other products. Meanwhile, the test bench for today's testing is a little different than usual. I've got the 6700K with an EK Supremacy Evo and a D5 pump as the radiator test system, and I'm using Arctic MX2 as the thermal paste, as usual. I'm also using an air-cooled EVGA GTX 1070 for the win, since I'm purely looking to test the CPU thermals, since this is a CPU thermal test. But, of course, this throws in a rather controversial dilemma into the mix. If I mounted the radiator flush to the test bench, I would lose airflow. But if I mount it like I have here, I have the full airflow that goes over the graphics card. So to combat this, I've created a deflector in the form of a lid that I found from a box and placed it at an angle to drive airflow away from the graphics card. Now, this doesn't bother me as much as it may other people, and I'll have to create a more robust setup in the future, but I'm confident there is very little recycling of air going on, and the unrestricted, albeit angled clearance of the exhaust shouldn't be causing too much resistance either. But I'll be maintaining this setup throughout so the tests can be compared regardless. So, as stated earlier, I'm testing a good set of radiators, so I started with all the radiators, swapping between each, and then moved on to the TD02-RGB afterwards. Okay, now I'm not saying do this, but it does save time, and it helps not having to get a power supply unit out and isolate it off. So, this is all plugged in as usual. Hit the power button, and it's doing a double post, so that's cool. There you go. And it'll start pulling it through. And the majority is filled now, so the rest are just going to be bubbles coming through, and that is filled. Depending on how you set up your water cooling system, it can be as quick as that to fill it up, but other ones can be a huge pain. there we go. Now I don't need to deal with a power supply unit, and I don't need to deal with connecting cables or wires. It's all done. So let's get some testing done. Of course, as usual, tilting and turning of the system was required to make sure most of the air was out of the main components for each setup, but once all of the various radiators were tested, it was time to install and test the TD02-RGB. So to clarify, we're putting the TD02 up against a setup with various radiators and 2200 RPM F4120ERs. You can find all of the info for the test bench setups in the video description. Finally, onto installing this thing. Starting with the backplate and setting up for an 1151 socket, these half-head screws drop into an asymmetrical hole, much like the screws of a Hyper 212 Evo mentioned earlier. Obviously this doesn't work well by itself, but adding the included spacers that grip tightly onto the shank of the screw means the backplate is separated from the board, the screws don't fall out due to the grip of the spacer, and can't rotate thanks to the asymmetrical hole. So full marks with regards to the universal backplate, and it's also nice that the screws were perfectly aligned with the holes of the motherboard, which doesn't always happen with a built-up backplate. Some of you may have noticed something that looks a little strange, and for those of you who haven't, this should help. I assure you to the best of my knowledge this is the correct orientation for mounting to an Intel socket. Taking a look at the manual, the only indications of which side the plate should be oriented are the arms of the bracket and the small engraving of the CPU manufacturer to the inside face. I could only guarantee which way it should go via the instructions by zooming in on the browser, which could have been really tough with a printed version. Not to say that they shouldn't include a printed instruction set if that's your opinion, but it could have been tougher. It makes sense that the arms are positioned as feet pressing against the board, and I've not seen this done any other way on other coolers, but next time this is the case I'd like to see another magnified graphic for the engraving, and maybe some text to clarify the orientation. Not a big deal, but it could be confusing to some people and wouldn't take a lot of effort to improve. Next up are the plastic standoffs that, like the spacers previously, rely on friction to hold the backplate in place. And to my surprise, they do a really good job. I wasn't expecting them to be as functional as they are. They slide on easily and provide a pretty firm grip on the shank of the screw, which makes it easy to install the CPU cooler in a second. Now, I've not worked with an AIO cooler before, so I've never had to install a radiator with a pump hanging off it, but that's the simplest way to do it, since the radiator is the heaviest component of the unit. I'm just installing it with 3 angled brackets, which did the trick for the 280mm radiator, so I'm pretty confident it's enough for this 240mm radiator. To take the weight off the tubing connections, I went to install the CPU block next, obviously. As mentioned earlier, I'm using Arctic MX2, which is a very average thermal paste, but I'm using a lot of it. Not to increase heat transfer or anything like that, more would make it worse in that regard, but I over-apply thermal paste to ensure full coverage regardless of the mounting solution. When I went to slot the block's bracket over the posts, I hit a small snag. The angled connector was clashing with the first RAM slot since it protrudes 20mm from the side of the pump. So I had to change the orientation of the pump, which isn't a big deal, but the upside is that the SilverStone logo is symmetrical, so it shouldn't cause any issues for those of you who have symmetry and orderliness-based OCD. As for the spring screws, they're nice and short, so they don't cause any problems to install and don't take long to install on that point, but I'd really like to see these coated in the same grey finish as the fan screws to match the overall appearance. Something I do with my reviews is to remove the cooler after the installation, just to see how the thermal paste spread out. Now, although I used a lot of thermal paste on some other coolers, it doesn't get spread out evenly. It's rare that it doesn't, but sometimes it doesn't. But there were no problems with the TD02-RGB, so we can move on. Speaking of which, let's fix some fan screws to the radiator. Now, I wanted to test the TD02-RGB with the same fans I tested the other radiators with, and the fans that came with the AIO. But the EK F4120ER's fans are about 1mm too wide at 26mm compared to the standard 25mm fans that come with the cooler. I tried some other screws I had for radiators, but if you do this at home, make sure that the length is correct so it isn't going to interact with the fins or vanes of the radiator, and make sure you're matching the correct thread. Either way, I didn't have screws long enough to accommodate for the extra millimeter of the fans, frame, and the plastic side covers. So I had to settle, and when I say settle I mean go for the original fans that came with the cooler that run at 142 meters cubed per hour, which is 11 meters cubed per hour over the Vada fans I usually test with, so this AIO is getting a touch more airflow than the radiators tested earlier. As for the wiring of the fan connectors go to the fan headers, so no problem there, but there's a little more going on with the LED situation, so I'd rather go over that in person, sort of. This is going to be all information in a slightly odd format, so please feel free to skip this section if you're really not into the LEDs, using the timestamps below. Hello there! So this is something I do when I've got not necessarily a complicated thing to discuss, but something that's more complex than a simple pan and an explanation. Something that has lots of variations and stuff like that, and sometimes things that go outside of the warranty, and frankly a janky format like this actually does suit that rather well. So in terms of controlling the RGB-ness of all of your components, I have got all the RGB components, the pump and the two fans all connected and daisy chained together through to this one connector here, which you can first, control-wise, connect this to your RGB header on your motherboard, if you have one. If you connect that to your RGB header on your motherboard, you can download the proprietary software that comes with your motherboard and control all the RGB values through that, and then get some effects and all that sort of stuff going on. But if you don't have that, then you can use the 4-pin connector. This is a 4-pin Molex connector that connects directly to your power supply unit, and what did that do? Okay, so I literally had, and I've had problems with this connector already, so I'd like to first say that this should be upgraded to something more robust. I had a little bit of metal that's just been pulled out of one of the sprung pieces of sprung pins on the side here, which, you know, the slightly bent out piece of metal that provides some resistance. Yeah, one of those is snapped off. I've had a lot of trouble with this, connecting it and disconnecting it in other takes. But anyway, what you can do is connect that there, and perfect example here is one of the pins has already pushed itself out, so I need to get something to push it back in. I'll do the same for the others as well. Don't recommend doing it when it's on. Don't recommend doing it with a metal set of things in case you bridge some contacts and then blow something, but I just did, so whatever. So what you can do is connect the 4-pin Molex connector to, which has a universal RGB connector on the end, and you can link that using the 4-pin connector they provide you with, the male-to-male connector, and then make sure the arrows are in the correct orientation and connect those together. Then you get a blue LED on the fans and the pump. But that's only a blue LED, so that's your sort of fast scoping boundaries with regards to using this in its intended way. More on that in a second. So if you want more control in a way where you don't have to go through your motherboard, you can do something like, if you already have one or purchase one, get yourself a RGB remote kit. So you can get one from something like Cable Mod, which this one is one of those, but I don't necessarily recommend it over anything else. And then through the 4-pin connector, male-to-male connector that comes with the kit and with the Cable Mod kit as well, make sure you've got the plus aligned with the arrow, and then you get some power going through and control through the Cable Mod kit. Then you can use an infrared transmitter thing, remote, and then you can change all the colors you like and have varying different things going on. Purple's lovely. So if you have that, that's great, but those can be costly. So if you want a super cheap alternative and you happen to have some wires hanging around, I guess, what you can do is, and before I go any further and explain this, this will void your warranty, so don't do this if you want to stay inside your warranty, but if you don't care, then you can do this. And frankly, this is a free kit that I got sent to me, so if I can't explain this on this free kit, then I don't think it's viable for me to do it anyway. So, what I've done here is connect a pile of these sort of coloured cables or coloured wires in their various sort of positions. So you can see that at the top there's the plus or the arrow, which is signifying the 12 volt connection. I think it's 12 volt, could be 5 volt, but anyway, 12 volt I'm going to say it is. That's got the white cable, and then the G for green, that's got the green cable, the R for red's got the red cable, and the B for blue has got the blue cable. That's coming out of the daisy chain connector that connects to all the components to control the LEDs. And then what I've got connected to the blue one, specifically, because I've set this up the same as the original cable does, I've got that connected to the blue pin on the Molex connector, and then the white connector for the 12 volt is connecting through to the arrow, which signifies the 12 volt. So that's how it's connected before. But what you can do, and you don't need all these cables, you just need as many as you want, you can disconnect the sort of blue connector and connect it to the red one. So the blue connector from the Molex is now connected to the red one, and it gives you red light. Then you can disconnect that one and throw it onto the green connector, and you get green light, and that's pretty much that. But what you can also do is actually mix up color values. Now, I do find this looks better when you do it with the red ones, to be honest. But you can throw red and green together, and you get yellow, and you can throw red and blue together, and you get purple. And you can throw them all together, and I'll try to do this now, which is generally a pain. You can throw them all together and get white. There you go. So if you just have either these kind of Arduino quick disconnect things with a breadboard lying around, or I don't know, maybe your child has from one of their projects or whatever's going on, you can do that, or just get yourself some generic wire, but I generally recommend these because they actually fit into the holes for the connectors relatively easily, and then you can add a touch of solder on the ends if you really don't care about your warranty whatsoever, and have that sort of permanent control. So whenever the PC powers up, you get that color. So that's pretty much that. That went on for probably about 5 to 7 minutes, so apologies for that, but I do think it's one of those things which, I don't know, it's something you can do, but nothing that you may get recommended to do by any manufacturer. But again, it's actually easier and more convenient to use a kit of whatever you fancy, whether it be Cable Mod or whoever it is, and that's, yeah, you get the convenience factor, but if you don't want to spend the money, then you can certainly do something like this. So let's move on to the thermal testing results. Right, thermals. So you've seen the setup for the radiators with the custom loop and of course the TD02-RGB. I've added the results for all the radiators and the AIO to the same graphs as the air coolers, and we're looking at the top 15 coolers I've tested. Naturally, we'll see some coolers drop out and into the graphs at the low performance end at the top, but I'll highlight all the talking points as we go. You can find the color-coded key below the graphs, and above is a setup description. All fans, including those on the GPU, were running at full speed to remove any fan curve variables, and the GPU had to run without the additional airflow from the radiator to at least attempt to maintain fair test principles, hence the addition of the deflector. And as usual, the temperatures you see are in a delta T format, which means the temperature of the room has been subtracted from the result to normalize the numbers and make everything more comparable. So let's run through some graphs. We're going to skip through the graphics-based tests since they have very little bearing on CPU thermals. So starting with the Firestrike physics test, you can see the radiators are all stacked together at the bottom, where you'd expect. But what's a little unusual is the 120mm slim EK radiator is 1 degree Celsius ahead of the TD02, but we're still within tolerance. And the 280mm EK radiator is in the fray of the other dual fan radiators, not noticeably further ahead. More on this later. The combined test mixes things up by throwing the TD02 in with the largest CPU air coolers I've tested, like the Dark Rock 4 and the Legrand Macho RT, which is really interesting, and you can see about 3 degrees cooler are the majority of the water cooling radiators. We're going to skip past Unigine Heaven and Unigine Superposition since they don't provide a lot of CPU load, but pause if you want to read the results for yourself, and we're going to jump straight into Rise of the Tomb Raider. Here we see the TD02 right in the middle of all the radiators, which is where you'd expect it to be. But results like this really sketch me out since we're seeing the slim dual radiator, EK radiator, ahead of the thicker EK radiator. But there are some parameters like fin density that are higher on the slim radiator and liquid capacity that's higher on the thicker radiator, which may or may not be playing a role in this. Anyway, Hitman sees the TD02 slide back into the top of the air cooler pack, and now the thick 240mm radiator is on top. So we could be looking at benchmark length issues or testing tolerance, adding to the mix of performance data. But the results are averaged over multiple runs, which should at least help with the tolerance situation. GTA 5 sees the Tundra TD02-RGB slip again into the top of the air coolers, outside of the testing tolerance of the radiators below. But the true test of which of these coolers deals with the full load of the 6700K, which used to be more relevant but still packs a 100-watt load similar to that of the mainstream CPUs today, is the Prime 95 test. I was also running Furmark at the same time to load the GPU to stay consistent with the testing of the air coolers, which, as with the other testing, required the exhaust airflow of the radiators to be deflected away from the graphics card. I'm not sure if you realize this, and I still don't know if I do, but according to MSI Afterburner at least, if you run your GPU at full speed, it does have an impact on the wattage of the CPU. Anyway, here is what we saw after the 10 minutes of torture testing the TD02-RGB, and it ends up nearly at the top of the stack of the air coolers, but we see the slim 120mm radiator slightly ahead of it, followed by the rest of the radiators in the order you'd expect them to be. This kind of test is the most accurate for understanding the maximum performance of coolers relative to the other coolers. So compared to the EK custom loop setup seen earlier with the similarly sized slim radiator, the TD02 on the 6700K runs at about 5 degrees hotter at full load and full fan speed. Now that's not bad at all, and it does get better when you factor cost into the equation. The cheapest custom loop setup from EK, which is not the cheapest way of doing this, but I'll proceed anyway, with a similarly sized radiator with comparable fans, CPU block, black tubing, barbed fittings, and the most affordable EK pump without the reservoir and without the RGB-ness would cost about €250 or your regional equivalent compared to the £85 cost of the TD02-RGB. But that is not where the price to performance situation ends. Now obviously if you just isolate it to the few coolers that I've tested, then you may come out with a good or bad or whatever result depending on which one you look at. But you can pick this up, and I did mention before you can pick it up for £85 through Amazon, but that is not the best place to buy it. Scan.co.uk in the UK, at the time of recording, is selling it for about £60, which puts it into the ballpark of the Dark Rock 4 and the NHD15S. And if you went for something like the Grand Macho RT, then you're nuts, because that costs something like £85 or some crazy cost. Anyway, so if you compare it to the air coolers, then the price performance is sort of even-ish, but like the air cooler, like the NHD15S in my testing, was the better performer. But there are benefits to going with an all-in-one liquid cooler like this, or other ones similar in terms of size. This is approximately, I think it's 120mm thick, this radiator. It is the same size as the fans, and the fans are 120 wide. So that means you've got a better CPU cooler clearance, or a lower CPU cooler clearance than you would with something like the NHD15S, which is 160mm tall, sorry, by itself. So you would need a much wider case to be able to accommodate that, whether you could go for a smaller case with something like this. And especially some ITX cases that are slim, I did review the RVZ03, which is also a SilverStone case, but I can't think of another slim one. I think that's the only one that I've actually reviewed. Not picking that out of the... No, not specifically picking that since it's a SilverStone product, but that is just one I've done. But anyway, or one of these, a Thermaltake Core P3, which is very slim, but it's a test bench, so I guess that doesn't really count. Sorry about that, all over the place today. One thing that is actually worth mentioning is a couple of the pros, cons, and missed opportunities, perhaps. I haven't made a list this time, but I'll just run a few off my head. So in terms of pros, the thermals were solid for a cooler, let alone whether it's an air cooler or a water cooler. They're pretty solid, and for the price, they're fair, like we've just discussed. I found mounting was very simple, so yeah, that was very nice. I actually found the spacers and the washers, that sort of stuff, was way more useful than I thought they would be. The friction mounting actually helped a lot there, and the build quality I find is actually fantastic, so there's no marks off for that at all. Perhaps some of the connector, the 4-pin Molex connector to the universal RGB connector, that was pretty limp, so I'd like to see a more robust version of that included in future revisions of this sort of thing, and any future AIOs or any of those connectors that SilverStone are to produce and send with their products. I'd like to see that improved, because in terms of lining up the pins, that was a nightmare to begin with, and one of them snapped off. Might have been just the one in this case, but then again it might not be, so I don't know. Maybe check out failure rates or customer complaints or something. If that's a commonly occurring thing, then maybe that needs a bit of an upgrade. And that's shaking around really annoyingly when I bang my knee. So anyway, I think that's pretty much it. A couple of things to mention, actually. One sec. Bouncing away from SilverStone for a second, I have actually been contacted by Arctic, and they sent me a handwritten letter, which is nice, but that's besides the point. They've actually sent me the Arctic Freezer 34 Esports Duo, and I'm going to be checking this thing out for a review. What I'm going to do with this, instead of just reviewing it, because, I mean, you can just review anything, and I do just review anything, but what you can do with this is, since it has 2 fans, is test it without the one initial fan and test it with the initial fan, and maybe test it without any fans and just see what happens. I mean, I haven't got any extra auxiliary airflow going across this test bench, so that will probably end disastrously, but at least it'll be able to see if it competes against something like the L9i, which is only 37mm tall. But anyway, so that's something I'm going to be doing in the near-ish future, depending on when I get around to it. There's also something else that I can't actually discuss still, so I'll get onto that at another point. And Joe, I haven't actually managed to get hold of Joe. You may have seen him in previous videos. Joe, I need your help for that one in the future, and I'll tell you what it is whenever I catch you next. There's also the background DIY project. It is still in a veiled or something, but yeah, I've still got to work on that. I'm going to need an extra couple of days or something to actually finalize that physically, and then coding wise I need to sort that out too. Thank you so much for checking this video out. Oh yeah, there's also last thing. Oh god, SilverStone has actually got in touch with me again. They would like to send me another case. They are thinking of sending over the LD01, which is a really nice looking case. It's actually, we were discussing on the Discord, which if you want to check out the Discord, there's a link in the video description. The Discord, we were discussing inverted PC cases, and that is an inverted PC case. It's a micro ATX case. It looks like it's got some interesting cable management towards the rear and good drive support, but maybe a little bit dodgy on the thermals because of all that tempered glass. So I'll be more than happy to check that out and test the thing, see where it ends up. Perhaps we might see something a little bit of a poorer performer, which would be interesting for the graphs. Maybe SilverStone wouldn't like that so much, but who knows. We'll see what it's like when we get it. And they also said if I've got any builds or projects that I'm thinking on doing and I need a part here or there, then they might be interested in supporting me, and I have got something coming up, so I'll be making a separate video about that and asking for your guys' help to help me put together a build. So cheers guys, I will catch you in the next one, which will be something, and yeah, thanks for checking this one out, and I'll catch you then. Bye bye.